Ladies and gentlemen, this is TVP World. I'm your host, Benjamin Lee, and welcome aboard the Eastern Express. On this episode, we're taking a closer look at a topic that, for once, isn't just a metaphorical bombshell. It's an actual one. Vladimir Putin has decided that things weren't quite precarious enough and has therefore lowered the bar for when Russia might use nuclear weapons. Because when you're sitting at a poker table with global stakes, the only thing better than bluffing is apparently not bluffing at all. The Kremlin's new nuclear doctrine was signed by Putin just last week. The document is essentially the official rulebook of Russia's nuclear policy. It was last updated in 2020, and back then it was all very, we'd only nuke if absolutely necessary. Now, the mood has changed. So without further ado, let's take a look at our latest report to find out more.
Russian President Vladimir Putin has approved changes to the country's nuclear doctrine, broadening the conditions under which nuclear weapons can be deployed. The updated policy considers attacks by non-nuclear states backed by nuclear powers as well as large-scale conventional assaults as grounds for a nuclear response.
We consider ourselves entitled to use our weapons against military facilities of those countries that allow their weapons to be used against our facilities. And in the event of an escalation of aggressive actions, we will respond just as decisively and symmetrically.
The move, approved on day 1000 of the war in Ukraine, followed a US decision to allow Kyiv to use American long-range missiles against targets on Russian soil, which Ukraine did. This video shows the attack on Russian army installations in the Kursk region with Western-supplied long-range weapons. The Russian response was a swift firing of a nuclear-capable intermediate-range ballistic missile at the city of Dnipro. Although not armed with nuclear weapons, the attack was a clear signal. Echoing these updated nuclear deterrence policies, former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev has warned that NATO missiles fired at Russian territory will now be considered an act of war.
Russia's new nuclear doctrine means NATO missiles fired against our country could be deemed an attack by the bloc on Russia. Russia could retaliate with weapons of mass destruction against Kyiv and key NATO facilities wherever they're located. That means World War III.
The war in Ukraine, soon entering its fourth year, has seen a constant string of escalation actions. This newest development may have put the world on track towards a second Cold War.
And now, let's take a look at the issue in greater detail. The doctrine includes 4 chapters with names that make them sound surprisingly boring given the context. First, there are the general provisions, which is basically the introduction. Then we have the essence of nuclear doctrine, which sound like a terrible TED Talk. Next is conditions for the use of nuclear weapons, which, casual. And finally, tasks and functions of the federal government, a cameo by Russia's typical bureaucracy, because, even nukes require paperwork. Now, if you're thinking this new version has more sections that say, don't worry, we'll only use these as a last resort, well, that was a nice thought, but you're going to be disappointed. In fact, Russia's doctrine has expanded the circumstances in which they might reach for that big red button. And here's the big change. It's not just about Russia anymore. Belarus is now officially mentioned, which means Lukashenko gets his own nuclear umbrella, because apparently one authoritarian leader with delusions of grandeur wasn't enough, we needed 2. It's like the buddy system, only instead of keeping each other from wandering off on a field trip, they're keeping each other ready for mutually assured destruction. Previously, the doctrine said that Russia would use nuclear weapons only if the state's very existence was threatened. Reasonable-ish for a nuclear power. But the updated version says that now aggression that presents a critical threat to sovereignty or territorial integrity is enough to pull the trigger. Now, you don't have to be a genius to see how slippery the slope is. It's basically a water slide with Putin at the top, ready to shove everyone down wherever he feels like it. And while we're on the subject, let's talk about a small, seemingly insignificant word that's gone missing from this doctrine, the word exclusively. In the previous version, nuclear weapons were described as exclusively a means of deterrence. The new one, just a means of deterrence. That's right, exclusivity is out, which means we're left wondering, What else are they considering using them for? Fireworks to play at the Kremlin? Personal disputes? The ambiguity isn't just unsettling, it's intentional. This doctrine is not about clarity, but instead keeping everyone else guessing, keeping the world on edge. In essence, Putin has taken the doctrine, which was already a source of anxiety, and added just enough ambiguity to make everyone break into a cold sweat. But the most terrifying part might just be this. Under the new doctrine, the mere presence of Ukrainian forces in Russia's Kursk region could be considered grounds for a nuclear response. And just when you think it couldn't get any worse, let's talk about Kaliningrad. The doctrine now specifically mentions that blocking access to critical parts of Russian territory could provoke a nuclear response. In other words, if someone cuts off Kaliningrad, a little Russian exclave wedged between NATO countries, it could trigger something catastrophic. However, none of this means that Russia is definitely going to use nuclear weapons. The doctrine itself isn't the launch button, but it's a clear escalation in rhetoric, a signal that under the right conditions, they are willing to go there. While the rest of the world is trying to figure out how to reduce nuclear stockpiles and avoid any potential for catastrophe, Russia is busy expanding the conditions under which they might decide to use theirs. And now here to shed more light on the issue is Martin Vladimirov, a director for Energy and Climate Center for the Study of Democracy. Hello, sir, and welcome to Eastern Express.
Thank you for inviting me.
So we are looking today at the newly updated nuclear doctrine by Vladimir Putin, and my first question would be, is this another instance of Russia saber rattling, or is it really about time that we look for the nearest bomb shelter with food, water, and our lifelong subscription to TVP World?
Well, I think the latest action is part of the Kremlin playbook to sow distrust and dismantle the unity of the transatlantic community on supporting Ukraine. It's an attempt to tap into well-entrenched fears within, especially European countries, that the conflict in Ukraine may lead to a much greater escalation that would involve these countries directly in the conflict. And considering that there is significant political instability in many European countries, and considering the fact that we have a lame duck president right now, President Biden in the US, I think Russia is using the momentum in order to try to get a good deal in potential negotiations over Ukraine next year.
Right, you mentioned a very key instance of the potential negotiation that might take place once Trump takes office. So do you think that it is a good thing for Russia to kind of tune up these sort of rhetoric right now? Won't they be looking at de-escalating the tension?
Well, escalating the tension would increase the motivation of European countries, especially, but also the US, to seek a faster kind of a truce or peace settlement deal, even if Ukraine does not agree on that. So it's part of the whole effort to internationalize the conflict as much as possible and to show that Russia is determined to achieve its maximalist goals in Ukraine, even with all the Western support for Ukraine, and even when most red lines have been crossed. It is again a symbol of Russia's resilience to Western pressure. That's what the Kremlin tries to show, that they can withstand the pressure and they will keep on crossing red lines. So, to be honest, we need to not fall for this trick. It's an old strategy of the Russians. It's a well-tested strategy. Even during the Soviet Union, they used similar tactics. This shows that actually Russia cannot achieve its objectives in eastern Ukraine and is ready to come to the negotiation table, but from a very strong position. And we need to make sure that Russia's position vis-a-vis Ukraine is much weaker. This means strengthening sanctions enforcement. We need to be clear that sanctions are not working. Both in the energy field and in preventing Russia from obtaining dual-use goods for its war effort in Ukraine. And we need to make sure that we have a common position on Ukraine, both in Europe and across the Atlantic, I think this position is crumbling right now. And part of the reason is that, European countries and their populations are becoming fatigued by the conflict. The attention has been switched to domestic issues, and it's a big danger. So there needs to be more political will, and I think adults in the room, especially in the most important capitals, Berlin, Paris, Brussels and Washington, where domestic concerns don't take over this critical long-term issue of deterring Russia's aggression. Russia is not going to stop after a peace settlement in Ukraine. This will be just the end of phase one of a broader attempt of Russia to expand its, political presence and even control over territory across the former Soviet Union.
Right, a lot to unpack here, but first I would like to kind of expand on what you mentioned. Perhaps, do you think that this is an attempt from both sides, Russia, Ukraine, to start gathering their bargaining chip and getting ready for that potential negotiation so that they coming into this with a stronger position?
Yes, this is one element of the story. The other one is that obviously, the decision of the U.S. Presidential administration to allow Ukraine to use long-range missiles in Russian territory has provoked this response from Russia, including also the launch of this ICBM missile against Ukrainian territory. This is, of course, a part of the kind of tactics and I would say theater of showing that Russia will, escalate, will not back down even if there is more pressure from the West. But in the end of the day, we need to realize the limitations of the Russian army in Ukraine and what it can achieve with its current resources. So falling for this trick would actually undermine our common position. It would undermine also Ukraine's efforts to contain Russia's advance in eastern Donbass. I think the Ukrainian military, despite the lack of enough resources, of material, of gathering enough forces on the ground, it is able to withstand Russia's aggression and advance. Ukraine is not crumbling. The Kremlin wants to create the impression that Ukraine is about to lose and to capitulate, because the position that the Kremlin wants to take in potential talks would be Ukraine is giving up, so they need to allow at least all these 4 regions that were annexed illegally by Russia to be basically given up. And Ukraine is not going to do that. We need to realize that domestically, even if there are structural reasons for Ukraine to try to concede some territory, domestically, the Ukrainian government cannot allow this to happen. So I think the Ukrainian army will keep on fighting. So Russia wants to make sure that the West loses hope that there will be a battleground success. There will be kind of a counteroffensive. And in this way, the international community, Europe and the US, are going to push Kiev into a deal that actually does not benefit the Ukrainian people or the Ukrainian government. So definitely this action is not directed towards Ukraine. It is directed towards European capitals and the US. And I think this will backfire, because just because the US and Europe might pressure Kiev on concessions, I don't think that there is any likelihood for this conflict to end swiftly. On the contrary, escalation is more likely because of lack of common perceptions about what each side wants to achieve. Russia wants to achieve one thing. The US, for example, in the face of the new administration of Trump, wants to achieve a categorically different outcome. And I think the clash of these two outcomes might actually lead to more conflict, more escalation, rather than a swift truce. This is just unrealistic at the moment.
Right. And there's also another factor that we have to take into consideration. You just mentioned earlier that some of the Western leaders need to have the political will to, well, continue to support Ukraine. However, we do see also these Western leaders being trapped between a hard rock and a very hard place, as in the domestic support, well, right now seems to be waning a little bit. And if they do insist on going this route, they might actually lose power because of that. How's there a way that they can balance and juggle these two topics, retaining their power in order to continue the support while, well, basically not losing their votes because of this?
Well, I think despite the rise of pro-Russian political forces across Europe and their growing presence in both the European Parliament and in domestic political assemblies, in the end of the day, the majority of the European population supports Ukraine, supports a strong response to the Kremlin aggression. And I think mainstream political parties need to be better in their communication strategy, in convincing why this resistance is important, and not to succumb to populism and, to be honest, to disinformation narratives that have been drowning the media space. There needs to be more attention on what we gain out of containing Russian aggression. How, for example, Europe was able to diminish its dependence significantly on Russian fossil fuels, how it used this crisis to accelerate the decarbonization of its economy, and how Europe might become a stronger international actor if it proves that it can withstand Russia's pressure. So these galvanizing forces should be the one leading domestic policies, rather than trying to appeal to the constituents that are now voting for far right, far left, pro-Russian parties. Mainstream parties are not going to win these voters back. They're already in the other camp. So it's important to focus on the constituencies that still support Ukraine, they still support energy security, that still support a stronger European military. And we need to show that the costs from supporting Ukraine are minuscule. For example, CSD worked with another think tank called KRIA to estimate what is the amount of money we pay each year to Russia indirectly buying fossil fuels. And the numbers are really small. Look, we're talking about 400, 500 euros per person per year that are being spent on Russian fossil fuels. These amounts can be replaced with targeted subsidies, targeted transfers to the most vulnerable groups, the most vulnerable businesses that would lose out of, for example, strategic decoupling from Russian energy. And we need to accelerate this process. We need to finish our homework, because this is one of the most robust and effective ways to undermine the war effort that Russia leads in Ukraine, meaning starve the Kremlin from the necessary financial resources to buy the weapons that it uses and to finance the accumulation of new manpower on the battleground. Right now, the costs for buying Russian energy exceed probably 180 billion euros per year. This is a fraction of the GDP of the G7 countries that have imposed sanctions. So the impact on their economies will be minuscule, and we should not overestimate what will be the consequences of fully decoupling from Russia. The consequences for the Russian economy, however, will be immense, and we need to focus on that.
Right. Thank you so much for your input and insight. Really appreciate it. And thanks for being with us on Eastern Express. Cheers.
Thank you.
And now we're moving on to the Eastern News Flash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you don't want to miss. A pro-Russian independent candidate has pulled off a surprising victory in the first round of Romania's presidential election, setting the stage for a high-stakes runoff on December 8th. The battle for the second runoff spot remains on a razor edge between pro-West candidate Elena Lasconi and Prime Minister Marcel Ciolacu.
With 99.94% of polling stations reporting, pro-Russian candidate Kaliningrad took the lead with 22.94% of the vote, despite criticism over his anti-NATO stance and past anti-Semitic remarks. The battle for the second runoff spot was extremely tight, with pro-Western Elena Lasconi of the Save Romania Union edging ahead of leftist Prime Minister Marcel Ciolacu by just 770 votes. At the time of recording, Lasconi currently holds 19.17% of the vote, narrowly beating Ciolacu's 19.16%. Votes from the North American diaspora are still being counted, leaving the outcome uncertain. The result marks a seismic shift in Romania's post-1989 political landscape. If Lasconi holds her lead, it will be the first time since the fall of communism that the Social Democratic Party fails to advance to the presidential runoff. The runoff between Gheorghescu and Lasconi is being framed as a clash of ideologies, with Romania's place between East and West at stake.
Russia's inclusion of greenhouse gas emissions from occupied Ukrainian territories in its latest UN climate report has sparked outrage at the COP29 summit in Baku. Voicing their protests, Ukrainian officials called it an attempt to legitimize the occupation.
Tensions flared at the COP29 climate summit as Russia included greenhouse gas emissions from territories it occupies in Ukraine in its latest inventory report to the United Nations, drawing sharp condemnation from Ukrainian officials. Ukraine's Deputy Environment Minister Olha Yukhmychuk urged the UN's climate body, the UNFCCC, to address the dispute, calling it an attempt by Russia to use international platforms to legitimize the occupation of Ukraine. The controversial move follows years of Russia reporting emissions from Crimea, annexed in 2014, and comes amid reports of Russian President Vladimir Putin positioning for peace deal talks with incoming US President Donald Trump, which could determine control over occupied regions.
The Financial Times reports that Russia's armed forces has recruited hundreds of Yemeni men to fight in Ukraine. The appearance of these men in Ukraine shows how the conflict is increasingly involving soldiers from abroad as casualties rise and the Kremlin tries to avoid a full mobilization.
According to the Financial Times, Russia has recruited hundreds of Yemeni men to fight in Ukraine, promising high salaries and potential Russian citizenship. The men were allegedly transported by a Houthi-linked company to Russia, where they were forcibly inducted into the military and sent to the front lines. The Financial Times report highlights Moscow's reliance on foreign fighters, including alleged deployments from North Korea, as it seeks to avoid a full domestic mobilization. Analysts say the tactic underscores the Kremlin's growing desperation to sustain its war effort in Ukraine.
Let me explain just a...
And that's all on this episode of Eastern Express. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.